Deep in the Colorado desert sits a concrete fortress where human contact is entirely prohibited. The cells are carved from solid poured concrete, the bed, the desk, the stool, all a single block. The windows tilt only toward the sky, ensuring no inmate ever knows where he stands within the perimeter. This is ADX Florence, and once a man steps inside, he effectively ceases to exist. Opened in 1994, this Supermax was built for one reason: absolute psychological containment. It houses the individuals deemed too volatile, too powerful, or too lethal for standard maximum security yards. Today on Prison Files, we unmask 5 inmates who forced the federal government to rewrite the rules of isolation. A billionaire cartel kingpin whose global empire was erased by a 7x12 concrete box. A prison gang warlord who ran a national crime network from inside the very facility built to silence him. A lethal inmate who proved that traditional walls could not protect the guards meant to control him. A domestic terrorist kept under some of the tightest communication restrictions in the federal system. And a mafia hitman whose path to that same facility took 5 years. A body count of 1 and a federal indictment to complete. You are watching Prison Files. Case number 1. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán.
6 months ago, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán escaped from the most secure prison in Mexico. This surveillance video shows his last moments in his cell before he walks into his shower stall. That's when he climbed into this mile-long tunnel where he hopped on a retrofitted motorcycle and rode these tracks to freedom. This was his second escape from prison. El Chapo, which means shorty, may be just 5'6", but he was also one of the biggest and most violent drug lords in the world. He's run the notorious Sinaloa drug cartel, worth about $3 billion. The cartel is responsible for much of the violence that has plagued the streets in parts of Mexico.
Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was never supposed to be contained by standard architecture. As the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, his wealth did not just buy weapons, it bought infrastructure. He was born Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Loera on April 4, 1957, the oldest of 7 children in La Tuna, a remote farming settlement in the Sinaloa mountains where opium poppies were the region's main cash crop. His father worked the land and, by most accounts, was physically abusive, and Guzmán would later describe an upbringing built on farm labor and beatings rather than schooling. From a young age, he sold oranges to help support the family and reportedly showed an early fixation on money, counting whatever cash came his way. In his mid-teens, he began growing his own small marijuana plot with cousins, and by his late teens, he had left La Tuna for good, taking a job as a driver and logistics runner for Sinaloa trafficker Hector Palma, before rising through the organization run by Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo. When Gallardo was arrested in 1989, Guzmán used the opening to found his own operation, laying the groundwork for what would become the Sinaloa cartel. He was first captured in Guatemala in 1993, extradited to Mexico, and sentenced to 20 years for murder and drug trafficking. In 1995, he was transferred to Puente Grande, a facility officially classified as maximum security. What happened inside told a different story. Guzmán received regular visits from his wife, his brother, and cartel associates. He kept a mobile phone. According to testimony later given at his New York trial, he was supplied with new shoes, wine, and food brought in from outside, and was allowed drives beyond the prison walls whenever he requested them. Puente Grande did not contain Guzmán. It employed him. On January 19, 2001, Guzmán walked out. According to the most widely corroborated account, a guard on his payroll, Francisco Camberos Rivera, known as El Chito, opened his cell in the middle of the night and helped him climb into a cart loaded with dirty laundry. Guzmán later told an associate, who testified to it years later in court, that he counted the clicks of the cart's wheels against the floor tiles to track how far they had traveled through the building. The cart passed through electronic doors that had been left open and hallways that had been left unguarded. At the final checkpoint, the guard let the cart roll ahead of him alone, and Guzmán lay still inside it, certain that if it tipped over, the escape would end there. it did not. He was driven out of the compound in a laundry truck and vanished. In the investigation that followed, Mexican authorities implicated dozens of prison staff, including senior officials, in the breakout. Guzmán spent the next 13 years as a fugitive, and in that time the Sinaloa Cartel grew into one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in the world, responsible for a significant share of narcotics entering the United States. He was recaptured in February 2014. In July 2015, he did the impossible a second time, and did it from a prison built to be a near copy of the one he had already escaped. Engineers working for the cartel spent months digging a tunnel more than a mile long beneath Altiplano Federal Prison. It was ventilated, wired for lighting, and fitted with a modified motorcycle running on rails to move equipment through it. The shaft opened directly into the shower stall attached to his cell. Investigators later theorized that the same corrupt former security official who helped plan his 2001 escape may have supplied blueprints for Altiplano as well, since the two prisons were built within a few years of each other and shared a nearly identical layout. Guzmán disappeared through the floor of his own bathroom, while guards patrolled the corridor above him. He was recaptured for the final time in January 2016. A little over a year later, in January 2017, Mexico extradited him to the United States, and by the time American prosecutors had him in custody, they already understood that ordinary confinement meant nothing to this particular inmate. He was held pre-trial under special administrative measures, known as SAMs, a designation reserved for prisoners considered capable of directing violence or criminal enterprise from behind bars. In February 2019, a Brooklyn jury convicted him on all counts, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, the same charge once used against major organized crime bosses. In July of that year, he was sentenced to life, plus 30 years, and sent to ADX Florence, where the restrictions that had governed his pretrial detention became permanent. Under SAMs, Guzmán has no contact with other inmates whatsoever. His legal mail and calls are screened by federal monitors before reaching him. His single hour of daily recreation takes place inside a small, high-walled concrete enclosure with a narrow mesh opening to the sky, the only glimpse of the outside world the facility allows him. There is no laundry cart at ADX Florence. There is no tunnel to dig, and no shower stall connected to anything but a drain built into solid rock. The facility does not try to out-engineer a man who has already beaten two different maximum security prisons. It removes the variable he depended on both times: freedom of movement and the ability to communicate. Everything else follows from that. At his New York trial, prosecutors laid out the scale of what SAMs was actually built to contain. Witnesses described a trafficking operation responsible for smuggling hundreds of tons of cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin into the United States over roughly 2 decades, generating billions of dollars for the Sinaloa Cartel and its allies. By 2013, the city of Chicago's own crime commission had named Guzmán its public enemy number 1, a designation the city had not used since Al Capone. That reach is precisely what special administrative measures are designed to sever. A standard maximum security sentence assumes that a prisoner's influence ends at the prison gate. SAMs assumes the opposite, that for a small number of inmates, the sentence itself means nothing unless every possible channel back to the outside world is closed at the same time. The man who evaded the combined law enforcement resources of 2 nations for over a decade, who turned 2 separate high-security prisons into personal headquarters, now lives inside a single poured concrete bunk. His fortune, his cartel, and his voice have all been reduced to the same outcome: a permanent and total severance from the world he once ran from a cell. Case number 2. Tyler Bingham. Tyler Bingham did not need to escape a prison to be dangerous. He used the prison system itself as his headquarters, and for years he did it from inside the same facility, built to stop men exactly like him. As one of the ranking leaders of the Aryan Brotherhood, a white supremacist prison gang founded at California's San Quentin in the 1960s, Bingham helped direct a criminal enterprise tied to dozens of murders and attempted murders across the federal system. coordinating much of it while confined to ADX Florence's most restrictive housing. Bingham's life before prison is, by design, one of the thinnest records in this episode. Court filings and reporting on the case describe him entering the federal system as a young man convicted of comparatively minor property crime, with none of the public record of a cartel empire or a documented childhood that defines most of the other cases here. What is known is that once inside, he found the structure he had not found on the outside. He rose through the Aryan Brotherhood's ranks quickly enough that by the 1980s, still a relatively young inmate, he was named to the gang's three-man federal commission alongside Barry Mills, placing him at the top of an organization with no legitimate outlet for his ambition except the prison system itself. The gang had originally formed among white inmates at San Quentin, seeking protection along racial lines inside California's increasingly divided prison population. But by the time Bingham rose through its ranks, it had evolved into something closer to an organized crime syndicate, controlling drug distribution and extorting protection payments across multiple state and federal systems. By the 1990s, Bingham, along with fellow Aryan Brotherhood leader Barry Mills, was already held in extreme isolation at ADX Florence. The Bureau of Prisons had concluded that placing its most dangerous gang leadership in permanent solitary confinement would sever their ability to run operations from a distance. It did not work the way anyone intended. Investigators would later testify that some cooperating informants housed in a separate unit of the same facility lived in far more comfortable conditions, with access to laptops and outside food, in exchange for their testimony, a detail that became a point of contention at trial. Bingham and Mills, held under stricter conditions, found their own workaround. In 1997, federal investigators allege Bingham smuggled out a message written in invisible ink made from urine, addressed to Aryan Brotherhood members at Usp Lewisburg in Pennsylvania. When heated over a flame, the message revealed instructions that prosecutors would later characterize as a declaration of war against a rival group, D.C. Blacks. Within days of the note's arrival at Lewisburg, 2 black inmates were stabbed to death in a coordinated attack carried out by Aryan Brotherhood members inside the facility. The Aryan Brotherhood operated on a structure prosecutors compared directly to a mafia commission, a small governing council making decisions that street-level members and prison-based soldiers were expected to carry out without question. Refusal or perceived disloyalty carried a death sentence enforced by the gang itself, not the courts. By the time federal investigators moved against the organization, they attributed dozens of murders and attempted murders across the federal system to orders that had passed through leaders like Bingham and Mills, including the killings of inmates Frank Joyner and Abdul Salam, both charged against Bingham as violent crimes carried out in aid of the racketeering enterprise. For nearly a decade afterward, federal prosecutors built a sweeping racketeering case against the gang's national leadership structure, eventually charging 40 defendants under the same statute originally written to dismantle organized crime families. 19 of those defendants struck plea deals before trial rather than risk a federal jury. Bingham was among the first 4 to actually stand trial in Santa Ana, California, in a proceeding that ran 5 months and drew on 6 years of intercepted mail, recorded prison phone calls, and testimony from former gang members who had turned informant. In July 2006, a jury convicted Bingham of racketeering and of the 1989 murder of fellow inmate Arva Lee Ray at Lompoc Penitentiary, a killing prosecutors said was ordered after Ray was accused of violating the gang's internal code by openly maintaining a relationship with another man and mishandling drug proceeds. Bingham was acquitted on a separate murder charge tied to inmate William McKinney. Prosecutors pursued the death penalty against both Bingham and Mills, but the jury deadlocked during the penalty phase, and both men were sentenced instead to life without the possibility of parole. Co-defendants Edgar Hevley and Christopher Gibson, convicted in the same trial of conspiracy in the Lewisburg killings, received 3 consecutive life sentences and 20 years to life respectively. Bingham appealed his conviction to the Ninth Circuit, arguing the racketeering charges and evidence had been improperly combined, but the appellate court affirmed his conviction and sentence in 2011, closing off his last realistic avenue to overturn the case. After sentencing, Bingham was sent back to ADX Florence, this time under a system that had already watched him operate from inside its walls once and had no intention of allowing a repeat. Prison officials tightened mail screening protocols across the facility and closed the specific gap that had let a coded, chemically treated note travel 2,000 miles between cells without detection. Barry Mills remained at ADX Florence until his death in July 2018, one day after his 70th birthday, having spent the last years of his life in the same restrictive housing where his and Bingham's operation had once run undetected. What separates Bingham's file from most Supermax placements is that ADX Florence did not stop him on the first attempt. It took a coordinated, multi-year federal investigation, a 40-defendant racketeering indictment, and a 5-month trial to finally close the loopholes his operation depended on. The concrete alone was never enough. It was the combination of total isolation and, eventually, total surveillance that ended his ability to give an order that anyone outside his cell would ever receive again. Case number 3, Jessie Conway.
Jessie Conway is guilty of first-degree murder for killing corrections officer Eric Williams of Nanticoke. Conway was an inmate at the federal prison at Canaan in Wayne County when he killed Williams in February of 2013. During the 2-day trial, jurors watched graphic surveillance video showing Conway attack Williams and stab him more than 200 times.
Traditional maximum security relies on an unwritten assumption that inmates, whatever their history, will not attack a corrections officer directly and without warning. Jessie Conway, a high-ranking member of the New Mexican mafia, shattered that assumption on February 25, 2013, inside Usp Canaan in Waymart, Pennsylvania. He was born on January 17, 1977, and raised in a poor neighborhood of Manila in the Philippines. Around 1986, his mother married a United States serviceman, and the family relocated to Rome, New York, where Conway, still a child, had to adjust to an entirely new country and language. According to his own defense attorneys, he showed early promise in his new home before drifting into drugs, alcohol, and petty crime in his teenage years, a slide that landed him in juvenile custody. By the late 1990s, he was serving time in the Arizona state prison system for a string of car thefts, and it was there that he first built ties to the New Mexican mafia, a prison gang with a strict, violence-enforced internal hierarchy. He was released in 2001, but the gang connections he had made behind bars followed him back into the free world. At the time of the Williams killing, Conway was not the life-sentenced inmate the public would later assume him to be. He was serving an 11-year federal sentence for conspiracy to distribute cocaine. Years earlier, in August 2002, he had committed a murder in Arizona, killing a man named Carlos Garcia, and that state case had continued moving through the courts while he served his federal drug sentence. Prison officials had already determined that once his federal time concluded, he would be transferred out of the Bureau of Prison System to begin serving 25 years to life for the Arizona killing. He was, in effect, on a countdown to a life sentence he had not yet started serving. He never got the chance to leave on those terms. Conway's affiliation with the New Mexican mafia placed him inside a prison gang structure built around territorial control of drug distribution within correctional facilities and strict internal discipline enforced through violence. Officers who worked with him described a calculated inmate who understood exactly how far Bureau of Prison supervision extended on a housing unit, and who chose his moment for the attack on a night when Williams was covering the block without a second officer present, a staffing gap that would later draw its own scrutiny from investigators reviewing the case. On the night of the attack, Officer Eric Williams, 34 years old and originally from Nanticoke, Pennsylvania, was working the housing unit alone, preparing roughly 130 inmates for lockdown. According to prosecutors, Conway charged at him, knocked him down a flight of stairs, and attacked him with homemade shanks, stabbing him repeatedly and fracturing his skull before Williams eventually died of his injuries. Video footage of the assault, later shown to jurors, ran for 11 minutes. When another officer asked Conway why he had done it, he reportedly said that Williams had disrespected him and that he could no longer tolerate it. Investigators later determined that Conway had been planning an attack on staff for some time and that Williams had simply been the officer working alone that night. Conway was moved to ADX Florence within days of the killing, joining a population that already included Ted Kaczynski, Ramzi Youssef, and Terry Nichols. Federal prosecutors initially sought the death penalty, a decision that dragged the case through years of pretrial litigation over jury selection and the constitutionality of capital punishment in a federal correctional murder case. Williams's parents, Don and Jean Williams, were given the choice of whether prosecutors should continue pursuing execution, and for years they supported that path, arguing publicly that a second life sentence stacked on an inmate already facing life would send no meaningful deterrent to anyone considering the same act. In 2017, on the eve of trial, Conway pleaded guilty to first-degree murder of a federal officer in exchange for prosecutors withdrawing the death penalty request. He received life without parole, a sentence that ultimately ran alongside the Arizona conviction he had been scheduled to begin serving before he ever attacked Williams. What makes Conway's file significant to how ADX Florence actually operates is what investigators found after his conviction, not before it. During later legal proceedings, prosecutors revealed that officials at ADX had discovered a piece of sharpened metal concealed inside a bar of soap in Conway's cell, evidence that even under Supermax conditions, absolute security is never guaranteed. Prosecutors used the discovery to argue that no facility eliminates risk completely. Conway did not need freedom of movement to remain dangerous. He needed only a few unmonitored seconds and a willingness to use them, and ADX Florence cannot promise those seconds will never come. What the facility guarantees instead is procedural, not architectural. Whenever Conway is moved anywhere inside the building, he travels under multiple officers and full restraints. A direct institutional response to an inmate who proved that staff cannot assume any prisoner, regardless of sentence length, will hold back. Eric Williams's murder remains one of the primary reasons federal policy now treats assaults on corrections staff as an independent threat category, separate from whatever sentence an inmate is already serving. The case also fed directly into a broader, ongoing debate over staffing levels at federal penitentiaries, since Williams had been working the unit alone that night. A practice corrections unions have argued for years leaves officers dangerously exposed, regardless of how secure a facility is on paper. Williams was not killed by a man with a life sentence and nothing left to lose. He was killed by an inmate serving 11 years who decided, over the course of a single night shift, that prison rules no longer applied to him. Case number 4, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev.
We're 2 years after the bombing at the Marathon killed and maim among a crowd of innocent spectators. These are the faces of the 3 lives taken in that moment and the police officer gunned down after. Today, the surviving bomber, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, was found guilty on all charges. The defense never disputed his guilt, and now their biggest fight comes next.
Dzhokhar Tsarnaev represents a category of threat that has little to do with physical violence inside prison walls. He was born on July 22, 1993, in Kyrgyzstan, the youngest child of an ethnic Chechen family that had been displaced from the Caucasus for generations. His parents brought him and his older brother, Tamerlan, first to the Russian Republic of Dagestan, and then, in 2002, to the United States on a tourist visa, seeking asylum from the violence that had followed Chechen families across Central Asia. The family settled in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and by most accounts of neighbors, teachers, and classmates, Dzhokhar assimilated easily. He enrolled at Cambridge Ringe and Latin School, became a popular student known for his sense of humor, made the wrestling team, and was eventually named a team captain. He later enrolled at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth and became a naturalized United States citizen in September 2012, 7 months before the bombing. Investigators and journalists who reconstructed his final years would point to his older brother's growing religious extremism and his family's economic decline as the backdrop against which Tsarnaev, by then in his final year of college, was drawn into the plot that would end his life outside of prison at 19 years old. On April 15, 2013, Tsarnaev and Tamerlan detonated 2 pressure cooker bombs near the finish line of the Boston Marathon, killing 3 spectators and injuring more than 250 others, several of whom lost limbs. 4 days later, the brothers killed a Massachusetts Institute of Technology police officer and engaged in a firefight with police in Watertown. during which Tamerlan was shot and then run over by his brother's escaping vehicle, dying of his injuries shortly after. The manhunt that followed shut down the greater Boston area for nearly a full day, with residents ordered to shelter in place while thousands of law enforcement officers searched door to door. Dzhokhar was eventually found hiding inside a covered boat parked in a Watertown backyard, wounded and unarmed. He was convicted on all 30 charges against him in April 2015 and sentenced to death that June. During the penalty phase of his trial, his defense team argued that Tsarnaev had acted under the influence of his older brother, portraying Tamerlan as the driving force behind the attack and Dzhokhar as a younger, more impressionable participant, an argument the jury ultimately did not accept as grounds to spare his life. He was sent to ADX Florence to await an appeals process that, more than a decade later, still has not concluded. The legal fight over his sentence has been unusually long, even by federal death penalty standards. In 2020, the First Circuit Court of Appeals vacated his death sentence, ruling that the trial judge had failed to adequately screen jurors for pretrial bias and had wrongly excluded evidence the defense argued was relevant to Tsarnaev's culpability relative to his brother. The Supreme Court reversed that decision in March 2022, reinstating the death sentence and ruling that Tsarnaev had received a fair trial. His legal team has continued to challenge the outcome since. In March 2024, a federal appeals panel ordered the trial judge to investigate renewed claims that two seated jurors had concealed relevant information during jury selection, a question that, as of this recording, remains unresolved and has been the subject of sealed filings and a contested recusal motion against the presiding judge. In December 2024, President Biden commuted the sentences of 37 of the 40 men then held on federal death row. Tsarnaev was one of only 3 whose sentence was left standing. In February 2025, the federal execution moratorium that had been in place was formally lifted, though Tsarnaev's still active appeals mean no execution date can be set until those proceedings are resolved one way or another. Inside ADX Florence, Tsarnaev's confinement is built around a single objective, preventing him from becoming an ideological figurehead. Federal officials have long treated high-profile extremists as a distinct category of risk, separate from ordinary violent offenders, on the theory that a prisoner does not need physical freedom to radicalize others. Correspondence, media access, or even indirect public statements filtered out through legal channels can, in theory, sustain influence over sympathizers on the outside or inspire copycat attacks. Tsarnaev's mail, reading material, and any communication with the outside world are subject to restrictions well beyond those applied to most inmates at the facility, and his access to coverage of his own ongoing case is tightly controlled by prison officials. He shares the facility with a small number of other men convicted of large-scale terrorism and espionage, including Ted Kaczynski's former unit and Ramzi Youssef, the architect of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Housing these men together, all under nearly identical restrictions, is itself a deliberate strategy. It denies any one of them a captive audience of lower security inmates who might carry radicalized ideas back into general population once released, since no one housed near them will ever be transferred anywhere else. The federal government's approach to this small group of prisoners has stayed remarkably consistent since ADX Florence opened, regardless of the individual ideology involved. Kaczynski mailed bombs to strangers over nearly 2 decades while evading identification. Youssef helped plan an attack intended to topple one tower of the World Trade Center into the other. Tsarnaev live-streamed nothing and issued no manifesto, yet the facility treats his case with the same procedural weight, restricting outgoing statements not because of what he has said, but because of what federal officials believe he could still say if given the opening. More than a decade after the bombing, Tsarnaev's case remains legally unresolved in a way almost no other inmate at ADX Florence can claim. Guzmán's cartel is broken. Bingham's channel to Lewisburg was found and permanently closed. Conway's sentence is final and unappealed. Tsarnaev's death sentence, by contrast, continues to move through the federal court system, vacated once, reinstated once, and now under renewed scrutiny. All while he sits inside a cell built to make sure that whatever the courts eventually decide, his voice never travels beyond it in the meantime. Case number 5. Fotios Freddy Geas.
Tonight, a former mafia hitman is reportedly the focus of the investigation into the prison murder of Whitey Bulger.
A former federal investigator told the Associated Press that Freddy Geas and at least one other inmate are suspects in the killing. Geas is a convicted killer who was tied to the mob in Springfield. WBZ's Beth Germano now has the latest.
Would it surprise you if Freddy Geas was Whitey Bulger's killer?
I'm not sure.
Fotios Geas was born on April 4th, 1967, in Springfield, Massachusetts, into a Greek family, an ethnic background that would later prevent him from ever becoming a formally made member of the Italian-American mafia he spent his career serving. He and his younger brother Ty grew up in West Springfield and built a reputation as feared street enforcers from their teenage years onward, developing long criminal records for assault and violent confrontations well before either of them was tied to organized crime. By the 2000s, the brothers were working as hired muscle for Anthony Arrelotta, an aspiring Springfield mob boss with ties to New York's Genovese crime family. Because they could not be formally initiated, the Geas brothers operated in a gray zone, carrying the family's authority on the street without ever holding official rank inside it. That arrangement ended in 2003, when Freddy Geas was accused of personally killing Genovese-aligned Springfield boss Adolfo Big Al Bruno and an associate, Gary Westerman, contract killings that would ultimately define the rest of his life. On October 30, 2018, James Whitey Bulger, the 89-year-old former Boston mob boss and longtime FBI informant, was transferred into the general population at USP Hazleton in West Virginia, arriving from a lower security facility in Florida, where he had spent the previous 4 years. The Bureau of Prisons has never publicly explained why an 89-year-old informant with his history was placed somewhere his enemies could reach him. He did not survive 12 hours. Guards found his body beaten to death in his cell the following morning. A belt with a lock fastened to the end of it was later identified as the weapon. Bulger's own history made him a target almost anywhere in the federal system. For decades, he had led Boston's largely Irish organized crime operation while secretly feeding information to the FBI about his rivals, an arrangement that let his own operation expand, largely unchecked for years. When the relationship became public in the 1990s, Bulger fled and spent 16 years as one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives before being captured in Santa Monica, California in 2011. He was convicted in 2013 of participating in 11 murders and sentenced to 2 life terms plus 5 years. To much of the federal prison population, and to men like Geas in particular, Bulger was not simply a fellow inmate. He was a symbol of exactly the kind of betrayal their code existed to punish. 4 inmates were placed in solitary confinement immediately after the killing. Among them was Geas, by then serving his life sentence for the Bruno and Westerman murders at the same facility. Investigators quickly identified him as the lead suspect in Bulger's death, alongside fellow inmate Paul DeCollegiero, with a third inmate, Sean McKinnon, accused of acting as lookout. Geas had built his reputation as a hitman with an open, documented hatred of informants, and Bulger, whatever his own violent history, had spent decades quietly cooperating with the FBI against organized crime figures much like him. What followed was not the swift transfer to ADX Florence that popular accounts of the case often assume. Geas remained in solitary confinement at USP Hazleton for years while federal investigators built their case, a period his family later described publicly as inhumane, noting that he spent 23 hours a day in a cement cell with almost no contact with the outside world and only 2 brief phone calls a month. It was not until August 2022, nearly 4 years after Bulger's murder, that federal prosecutors formally indicted Geas, DeCollegiero, and McKinnon. Geas and DeCollegiero were charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, aiding and abetting first-degree murder, and assault resulting in serious bodily injury, while McKinnon faced a separate charge of making false statements to a federal agent. Prosecutors initially left open the possibility of seeking the death penalty against Geas, since he was already serving a life sentence and had little left to lose, before formally declining to pursue it in a later court filing. Geas was transferred to ADX Florence in September 2023, nearly 5 years after the killing that made his name, once the scale of the case against him and the standing federal indictment had been fully established. In May 2024, after years of maintaining his innocence, Geas reached an undisclosed plea agreement with federal prosecutors. That September, he pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter in exchange for prosecutors dropping the more serious first-degree murder charges, and he was sentenced to an additional 25 years to be served on top of the life sentence he was already serving for the Springfield killings. DeCollegiero and McKinnon, the two co-defendants transferred out of solitary confinement years earlier while the investigation continued, also reached their own plea agreements around the same time, closing out a case that had remained legally open for nearly 6 years. Geas's file illustrates something distinct about how ADX Florence actually gets used, something the earlier cases in this episode do not. It is not simply a holding cell for inmates who commit violence inside prison walls. Placement there follows a legal and administrative process that can take years, shaped by prosecution timelines, forensic investigation, and negotiated pleas, not by the immediate aftermath of an attack. Only once that process concluded and Geas's role in Bulger's death was formally established through indictment and eventual guilty plea, did the Bureau of Prisons move him into a facility where inmates never share a cell, never cross paths during movement, and are never left unsupervised in any capacity. Whatever access or capability had once allowed him to reach one of the most infamous informants in organized crime history now ends permanently at the walls of his own concrete cell. Geas proved that a life sentence and a high-security placement were not enough to stop a determined killer inside the system. ADX Florence exists for whatever comes after that proof is established in court. Go back to where we started, a concrete fortress built deep in the desert, run on the near-total restriction of human contact. Every file in this episode tests that design in a different way. Guzmán proved that even a global cartel could be dismantled once a single line of communication was permanently cut. Bingham proved that isolation alone does not guarantee silence, and that it took a multi-year federal investigation to finally close the gap he exploited from inside the same facility meant to stop him. Conwy proved that a shorter sentence does not mean a safer inmate, and that the system had to change how it moved him, not just where it held him. Tsarnaev's case shows that some threats are never fully resolved on a fixed timeline, no matter how many years of appeals pass. And Geas proved that reaching ADX Florence is rarely immediate. For him, it was the final step in a process that began with a body on a cell floor and ended, 5 years and 1 federal indictment later, inside a concrete cell of his own. The walls at ADX Florence are the same thickness for all of them. The cartel kingpin, the gang leader, the staff killer, the unresolved case, and the mafia enforcer who waited 5 years to arrive. The file never fully closes on any of them. That is Prison Files. Tell us in the comments which case or which facility you want opened next.